Welcome to this next episode in our Emmes at Home series, a program developed by Emmes to share thought leadership safely and securely from their homes during a pandemic. We are here today with Dr. Darby Thompson, president of Emmes Canada. In your experience, how do you see real-world data being applied most often in clinical research, and what phase of research do you find it most useful?
Well, I think as we're moving forward and really grappling with what real-world data means and how it's used by the agency and the other stakeholders, it's everywhere. When we think of patient-reported outcomes, those are really becoming a critical element of FDA endpoints. If you look at some specific diseases and neurological diseases where you have migraine or epilepsy or other things that patients experience, Crohn's disease, women's health, they require reporting by the subject as a regulatory endpoint for approval. So they have a massive impact on late stage trials. And that technically is, even if you're collecting it under the context of a trial, you are collecting the patient's experience in their real life. And so patient-reported outcomes, data from wearables, all of that is really an important element of a lot of late phase 3 trials that are being conducted now. So that's a huge impact. But that said, real-world data is finding its way importantly into other elements of the product development landscape in mid-stage, early-stage trials, phase 2, phase 1. And that's in areas where you're looking at population or subgroup identification in phase 2, where maybe you've got some initial safety data, you really want to hit your phase 2 out of the park, you want to try and find the population where it's going to work the best. So you're going to start looking through existing real-world data to try and identify people that you think might respond, or people that you think you might be able to recruit, including engaging with key opinion leaders to find out who's being treated and who's not. Who are they treating and who are they not treating with existing drugs? Looking for biomarkers, looking for predictors of response. Those are all ways that the classical real-world data, EHRs, EMRs, all of those elements can influence the design of your mid-stage trial across the board, across all sorts of indications and products. In the earlier stage even, there's a massive impact, and I think this is where early stage trials are really underserved and where we can have a huge impact in terms of piloting systems. You see a lot of people, a lot of smaller companies really trying to save up and make a big splash in their phase 1. They want to do it as cheaply as possible, and they're penny wise and pound foolish. You see, because a lot of phase 1s or phase 1Bs, phase 1/2s, piloting the data, piloting the collection, piloting the product that's never been in people before, if that's possible in a registry, if that's possible to collect information from registries to identify populations, or at least engaging key opinion leaders to collect data on the basis of a registry, or to get survey data, to get patient-reported outcome information, even before you start phase 1, can have a massive savings on efficiently planning your early stage studies to go into the clinic as effectively as possible. I think the last thing I want to mention was like rare diseases is where most people think of real world data really having an impact, because you can't recruit patients. So people look at using external data as a external control arm to the trial. You don't need to randomize people in a rare disease to receive nothing. You can use patient-reported outcomes to access populations anywhere in the world, potentially, rather than just near your key opinion leaders when you only have 200 people in the United States or in North America that might have the disease. It's best to be able to try and collect that data directly from them. But I think those ideas from rare disease really have strong implications for all other diseases. If you find me an indication that can recruit like that, then you win. But most of the studies I've been involved with, the number one challenge is recruitment. And if we can be piloting systems in registries or in other real world settings to really understand the patients better, to understand the opinions of the key opinion leaders, and deploy these studies as effectively as possible using the real world data before the trial, I think that can have a huge impact. But as I said, it's real world data is everywhere, particularly in late phase with patient reported outcomes and those sorts of things.
That's great. Thank you very much. Now, no doubt you've worked on quite a number of studies in your time at Emmes. I was wondering if you have some examples of trials on which you or Emmes have worked where real world data was used.
Absolutely. I think the first one is, as I touched on the answer to the prior question, is the patient-reported outcomes. Virtually all of our latest trials involve some sort of ePro, whether that's understanding episodes of a condition, attacks, events, whether that is capturing compliance data reported directly from subjects, or whether it's collecting solicited symptoms. Even in vaccine development and infectious disease, you need to be understanding after the patient leaves the clinic, are they experiencing flu-like symptoms? Are they experiencing anaphylaxis? And those are patient-reported outcomes that the technology that we're using now has pushed out to really be very similar, whether we're collecting it in a phase 3 trial or a vaccine development trial, or a patient questionnaire that we're more typically see in a behavioral trial or a rare disease. Moving forward into decentralized trials, there's a huge ability to capture data from all sorts of different places in a decentralized or a virtual trial setting, and we are working on a lot of those. But some other specific examples sort of related to the topics I talked about a second ago. At Emmes, we ran through the Bone Marrow Transplant Clinical Trials Network, they ran a phase 2 trial within the network. So this is a registry that requires everybody going through a bone marrow transplant in the United States to be a participant in the registry or at the hospitals participating. And there was a sponsor interested in running a trial to look at a specific regimen to prevent GVHD following stem cell transplant. Well, the way they ran this within the registry was a number of centers volunteered to participate in this clinical trial and administer the experimental therapy, and they proceeded with those centers. The other centers that didn't participate were then a repository of patient information from which the statisticians at Emmes harvested patients who met the same eligibility criteria as the patients at the trial centers that were administering the experimental therapy. So the sponsor really was worried about running the trial at the experimental centers and focused on those. And then on the back end, integrated with the registry staff and data management teams and statisticians, they were able to extract the control group and compare them. Now, that was not at no cost. There was still a substantial cost to be able to access control subjects' data, but it was still in a very efficient way to do that, and that's in the literature. Another big project at Emmes, the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, is sponsored by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And what they do is almost all sort of this real-world data idea. They harvest post-marketing data from both adults and children who are receiving a drug off-label. They combine that with some smaller PK studies to show how the drug is moving through children's systems, and they combine that small experimental data with the larger real-world data from EHRs and surveillance, post-marketing surveillance on these drugs, bundle those and submit those to the FDA. They've submitted more than 9 applications for labeling change to the FDA to allow effective drugs to be made available to children, and that's literally harvesting EMR data. Couple here in Canada. We work with a biomarker company called Decipher Biosciences, and they have biomarkers that predict risk in bladder cancer and in prostate cancer. And we have validated those markers and achieved reimbursable reimbursement approval for those markers, all based on real world data, based on data from clinics, based on data from large cancer hospitals, based on registries. We have taken sophisticated statistical techniques to address the biases inherent in that data and show that this biomarker works. We're also working extensively on some of their pharmacogenomic products and their predictive biomarkers to try and see if we can predict who's going to respond to treatment. And again, that's almost all real world data at this point. For a biomarker company, it's a little different. They can get approved on the real world data, but when we get into a predictive classifier, gold standard is still going to be a trial, but you can't get to the trial stage unless you've really fleshed out the base layer. And so for that biomarker development company, their entire, if you will, phase 1, 2 was all real world data. And then when they get to a validation and potentially something that can go to the FDA, they are looking at more of a traditional trial. But they leveraged all that real world data to get to where they are. I have a few more examples, but really, real world data, in my experience, we have some cases where we have massive millions of records and we're trying to dig down and find something. But in a lot of the trials we do, real world data is small. It's not necessarily about high velocity, high volume data as the hype would lead. You see all these things about partnerships where you now have access to 2 million data records or 50 million billing records. That has its purpose and it has its use. In these settings, we're talking about maybe dozens of patients. We had a medical device company here in Vancouver that they deployed a product of theirs for platelet screening. It's called Light Integra. We're published with them, so I can reveal. We're working on a paper and we've published some other abstracts with them. They deployed their product to screen platelet donations that were going to stem cell transplant patients, very complex patients. And they ran quality studies at all these centers. So we spent almost a year working through all of this EHR data that they had collected on patients at the centers where they conducted these quality studies. And we have been able to show massive impact of the screening capabilities of their device to reduce morbidity, to reduce the number of transplants people receive. And that sounds big. We're talking about 5 hospitals, and when we distill it all down, we're talking about 400 or 500 patients. And we're able to demonstrate these sort of effects. Same with the biomarker company. That's hundreds of patients. They've grown it out into a large commercial repository now where we're applying the same things. But we can use, even in rare diseases, historical controls, registries. We're talking about dozens of patients. Real world data doesn't mean huge. Real world data means hard, is what it means. It means that there's other things we have to account for. But the really interesting thing to me is as we push real world data down the development chain, we're getting, we can get smaller and still have massive impact on how we can develop products. And it's really about looking for non-traditional data. What data is out there that we can leverage, right? It doesn't have to be a clinical trial that gives us information.
Thank you again for attending and have a great day.